an option to qualify for this grant to have no work history. In that case, that would not qualify them for co-enrollment if needed, would it?
Correct.
So yeah, and so we'll throw that out there, and as we're going through the PowerPoint, you know, feel free to address the no work history, but yeah, you couldn't be co-enrolled with no work history.
Right, and we'll cover all those types of details when we get to those.
Yep.
So it's 1 o'clock, so let's go ahead and, or a little bit before 1, but we'll start at 1 o'clock. David, could you go ahead and start recording this, please?
Sure.
Thank you. I'll have a few seconds to let you get that started.
You are ready to go.
All right, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 o'clock, and this is Jim Potts with Department of Commerce. Today, we're going to have a webinar on the IWDS, Illinois Workforce Development System, changes to our system related to the disaster recovery grants. This should be a really good opportunity to answer any questions out there. There's also a longer version of this PowerPoint. It's really step-by-step for a career planner on every screen that's associated with the application. So this that has some residual that's just generic questions. It's nothing associated with the disaster recovery project. It's just part of a regular application. So that's more probably for your day-to-day staff. What this PowerPoint's going to highlight the changes for screens and maybe some of the context of some of the screens for questions for the disaster recovery. It will not cover the details about the employment recovery grant. That's going to be under a separate PowerPoint. You'll see some changes on some of the screens. There's a question or two that's different that's been added, but we want to do a totally separate one for that. So this is going to be focused on the disaster recovery today. Besides myself, Jill Meske is on also. She's the grant manager and really the expert on this, and the information she gives me and has worked with our staff is how we've built the changes in IWDS. So feel free to ask a question of either her or I. But if I don't know it, I would say she would. So the primary objective of this PowerPoint is just to demonstrate the details about the new questions that have been added to IWDS for an individual under the National Dislocated Worker Disaster Recovery. For this terminology in this PowerPoint, the acronym for National Dislocated Worker Grants is DWG. So you'll see that in there. And then disaster recovery is DR. There's also under the National Dislocated Worker Grants, currently in IWDS, LWIAs 21 and 22 also have disaster grants related to the floods that they had in their areas. One of the different things about their grants is that those show up under the 1E title within IWDS. And we'll cover some of the things when you start to enroll people in services where that comes into play, that some of the career planners need to look for some of these little details. Also in IWDS, currently there are 6 different national disaster work grants for opioid crisis, but those are housed under the LWIA 90, so those would not show up in your regular traditional local workforce area. Some more details about the disaster recovery. One of the things that's really important for understanding is if a person is only going to receive the disaster relief employment type services, which includes disaster relief employment and the safety training related to disaster relief safety training and supporting services tied to those, they will end up being excluded from the LWIA performance. Now, if a client, if those are the only services received under this grant, but this grant could also allow for services under traditional employment and training activities. Now, so if that's done, the client would then fall into performance, of course. And then, or there could be a mix and match where they receive the disaster relief employment services as well as their employment and training service activities. And again, for those folks, they would fall under performance. Under the employment recovery, I said I'd touch on it a little bit, but we won't go into details for that. This PowerPoint, as I mentioned, will not go into the minute details of the employment recovery. You will see some references to it just because there's a new question on one of the screens, so I'm not going to ignore that question. We'll address it when it comes up. So some of the things to understand, under the disaster recovery eligibility, anybody who meets traditional dislocated worker would be eligible for services. The next, an individual who's been temporarily or permanently laid off as a consequence of a disaster emergency would be eligible. And then a self-employed person who loses their job or even becomes underemployed as a result of the emergency or disaster could be eligible. And then you have some new criteria under long-term eligibility, which is an individual whose work history, with a work history, who is seeking employment and has been unemployed or underemployed for 10 non-consecutive weeks out of the last 26 weeks, or an individual without a work history or with sporadic history, i.e. temporary or seasonal employment, multiple terminations, etc. For those bottom three characteristics besides the traditional dislocated worker, you're going to see in IWDS we've added additional criteria, and we'll cover those today. But if any of your clients meet traditional dislocated worker, that's how they should be certified, and they wouldn't need to be certified under the additional new criteria. And you'll see that pop up a lot in this PowerPoint because I reiterate it over and over, and Jill probably has in your communication. It's really important to make sure that if a client is traditional dislocated worker, that he or she is certified under that title for a few reasons. One, just for tracking, it'll let you see who's traditionally meets the eligibility of a dislocated worker. But two, if you're certified only under this alternative criteria, the client's only going to be eligible for services under the 1N title. So it restricts the ability to serve him or her under any other funding streams if the grant runs out or if runs out of money, or if the person just comes in late towards the latter part of it. So again, we'll cover more of that as we're going through. So now let's move forward with the disaster recovery application in IWDS and our changes. A few details about the PowerPoint. It's created in our training platform of IWDS. And in our training platform is where most of our mock grants and mock provider relationships are built under LWIA 20. So you'll notice it's under LWIA 20. The first thing always, and this is with every single WIA client, the person who's doing the data entry of it always needs to search the customer level record in IWDS. In this PowerPoint, it's not getting into the details about searching a customer. I just want to always reiterate that to make sure that thorough search is done, because if it's not done, what happens when the client or the career planner gets into the application, they end up having potentially some problems because there's a duplicate application or record already in IWDS. That other PowerPoint that I spoke about, the longer version, it goes more in depth about the search. So from this one, we're stating the customer's already in there now as a customer level record, but he or she, in this case a she, has no other application. And we know that because once we click on under list application, that's shown to the far right. If he or she, in this case a she, had an application, when they start to add here, the client would have already showed up with an application. So in this case, there's not an application, so we're just going to add. Here's some of the little details that's important. It's about the contact date. How IWDS is set up is our programmers put it in there for a lot of these questions that's relevant through this disaster relief, disaster DR grants, and actually the ER. You need to set the contact date on or after 6/1/2020 for them to show up under the guided application. So again, to show you the picture of it, contact dates. This is for a new client. If it's a client that's already in IWDS as an applicant or has a current registration, you wouldn't be able to do this. But for a new one, the contact date needs to be 6/1/20 or after. And then next is the guided applications. For the guided applications in IWDS, they're going to show up right now as NDWG, Emergencies, Disasters, Career, NDWG, Emergency Disaster Training Services. As I mentioned at the beginning, the correct acronym is DWG. but IWDS is currently incorrect for those titles. So there's a system change in, so there will be a change in the near future, on or about mid-August. It'll show up DWG, Emergencies and Disasters Career, and DWG, Emergency Disasters Training. But this is how it looks right now. So the top one under the 1N, the National Dislocated Worker 1N, Emergency and Disaster, that's the career services. And then the fifth one down is the training. Now the training would only need to be completed as part of the guided application if the intent was to put the client into training services. If the client was only going to come in just for the disaster relief employment type services, he or she would only need to have the career services. They wouldn't need to have up to the training service level. As I mentioned, there is a larger PowerPoint that I'm going to be sending out right after the webinar today. What I'd like you to do for that is make sure that gets distributed down to your staff who's doing the day-to-day work. In case they have any questions, it's even more detailed than this PowerPoint. If they're experienced, it probably is not that much helpful, but if you got newer staff, it is going to cover every single screen. So it's kind of handy for new staff or folks who haven't maybe worked with IWDS for a while. Again, you'll see, as I mentioned, I'll touch on this. As a reminder, any client who has been certified under any traditional dislocated worker title, the client will be eligible under your DR grants. You'd only need to use the alternative criteria that I'm going to be touching on in this PowerPoint when a client does not meet traditional dislocated worker criteria. Assessment testings, as with every adult and dislocated worker, if you're going to put a client into training services, he or she would need to have assessment tests. But if they're only going to get, as I mentioned, the employment, disaster employment related services, you won't need to do that. There was some new guidance put out recently by our policy under WIO Notice 19.01, Change 1, and it speaks about adult and dislocated worker clients who are only going to go into OJT or customized. They're not required to have a math and reading assessment test. So those rules still apply depending on what services you're going to provide for this client or your clients. Under the DR grant, if a client is going to receive disaster relief employment services only, then they would not be required to have the math and reading assessment tests. The next screen we'll touch on is the employment characteristics screen. This screen hasn't changed. There's no new eligibility on it, but I wanted to cover it just because there's some questions right now that I receive quite a bit about the different UI statuses. So we're going to talk about that with the pandemic unemployment versus the traditional UI. For the choices of labor status, this is for traditional dislocated worker eligibility. This comes into play, these choices for criteria under the title of unlikely to return to previous industry or occupation. There's no logic for this new alternative criteria tied to the screen here. Some of the other questions I want to make sure to cover is that UI status. The answers for UI, we haven't changed anything based on the new pandemic unemployment assistance, because a person, if they're drawing pandemic unemployment, the same as if they're drawing traditional unemployment, they're still either receiving benefits or eligible but not receiving, or exhausted if it's appropriate, or in some cases not eligible, not determined could be appropriate. One of the things to understand about UI and traditional dislocated worker eligibility, the UI status only has criteria tied under the portion of unlikely to return to previous industry occupation. It has no criteria under plant closure or substantial layoff or displaced homemaker or formerly self-employed, now unemployed, or spouse of an active duty service member. So it only comes into play if you're trying to certify your client under unlikely to return. Now let's talk about those traditional UI payments. Now traditional UI is received by a client who's lost their job and the employer had been paying into UI on behalf of the client. So the client goes in, he or she applies for UI, and as long as the employer doesn't dispute it, the client would be given UI or awarded UI benefits. And while he or she is looking for work, they're drawing their UI payments. Now, one of the things about the pandemic unemployment assistance, it came out, and it's for folks who would not traditionally be eligible to draw unemployment. My wife's a good example. She's a hairdresser. She works for herself. So when she got shut down, she was not able to draw any unemployment because she hadn't paid into on her behalf. So she was, after she had filled out the paperwork and waited a little while, she was eligible for the PUA, the Pandemic Unemployment Insurance. And that's where many of the folks who are formerly self-employed or are self-employed or independent contractors, and those are probably two of the most known groups of individuals that end up receiving UI. So if they receive pandemic, then they should record the response just as if they're receiving UI or if they exhausted or whatever the circumstances. And that's what this slide speaks about. Regardless if the individual receives traditional UI or PUI, if they're receiving either or have exhausted either, they would meet this portion of eligibility under unlikely to return. So again, as a reminder, that UI status is only has criteria tied to those folks who are trying to be qualified under unlikely to return to previous industry occupation. Now, for this particular mock client in my PowerPoint, she had gotten out of the Air Force in June of 2018, and she got a job working right after she had gotten out of the military, but she got fired from that job in December of 19, well before the pandemic and well before anything else went on. And she wasn't eligible for traditional unemployment, and then she wasn't eligible for PUA. So for this particular client, the appropriate response is not eligible, not determined. So we kind of know, if we look at this screen right now, that this client's not going to meet unlikely to return unless she would meet the tenure criteria, which is the alternative to UI. And that's what we're going to speak about. Tenure is the alternative to unemployment. And the definition for tenure is has been employed for a duration sufficient to demonstrate attachment to the workforce, meaning the individuals must have at least 6 months in employment in the industry occupation from which he or she was dislocated, but is not eligible for unemployment compensation due to insufficient earnings or having performed services for an employer that were not covered under the state's UI, or unemployment compensation law. One of the things about tenure, many people who traditionally would have met tenure ended up receiving pandemic unemployment assistance because it falls into that category of folks who are having performed services for an employer that were not covered under state UI or state unemployment compensation law. So what we're probably finding is, by and large, most clients who traditionally would have met tenure drew PUI, so they end up drawing unemployment. So, but now, often people, and that's what this slide just passes on, often people in the past who might have met the tenure criteria could be drawing pandemic unemployment or might have exhausted that PUA. As mentioned before, if an individual is drawing PUA or exhausted their PUA, they should be recorded appropriately under the UI status.
Hey, Jim, this is Jill. Can I jump in here with a question about the PUA?
Sure.
One of the questions is, do you know if our agencies can look up proof of PUA in IBIS like they can look up traditional UI?
That's a really good question, and this is the feedback that I've received from IDS, or from other folks actually who's passed on the information. It's they have a separate system, so it's not in the traditional IDS system for being able to look up. So we do not have a way to look up the pandemic PUA. I know there's been some local areas ask about it, and I know we've had Patty Schnorr's my boss has been in contact with IDS folks. Chris Tylen, the guy I work with, he's been working with LWIA 20 on this question, but as of right now, they have a separate system and there is no way to check on that. So your best chance to be like, for example, like my wife, she had documentation that, well, she's going back to work now, but when she was on PUA, that she could provide the documentation to show that she's eligible for or she's drawing it. So that'd probably be your best bet. It would be to get it just from the client himself or herself, because as of right now, we don't have a way to check. Any other questions about that? All right, let's move on.
Jim, this Michelle was asking, must we get documentation or can they self-attest?
Well, for the PUA, is that what we're speaking about?
I can't tell. Michelle just asked that question just now. So yes, she's saying yes.
Yeah, if you're using it for an eligibility criteria, so in the example you're using there, let's say this client's trying to be determined eligible under unlikely return to previous industry occupation, well, then you'd want the hard copy documentation. And again, the client, him or herself, should have some document that shows that. Now, if it's not an eligibility factor, let's say your client was being eligible as under plant closure or under a substantial layoff, as I touched on that, those do not require UI as part of your eligibility, so you wouldn't need the formal documentation. But if you're going to certify the client under unlikely to return to previous industry occupation, where UI status is part of the eligibility criteria, you would want the formal documentation. And did that answer that question? We're going to go ahead and move on. If it doesn't, go ahead and feel free to clarify it. On this mock client that I built, she did not meet tenure neither, because if you recall, she was laid off prior to pandemic UI. So in her case, she's not eligible for employment and she doesn't meet tenure. So at this point right now, this tells us that she's going to have to meet the alternative criteria, because her dislocation job is not going to be plant closure, not going to be a substantial layoff because she was released from her job. She's not going to meet unlikely to return, because part of that criteria is you have to either be eligible for or exhausted unemployment or meet tenure, and she doesn't meet that. So right now I know that she's not going to meet traditional dislocated worker. Now, the other questions on this screen, you have primarily employed farm work, minimum threshold farm work. Those have no eligibility questions tied to them. They're relevant for reporting and for alternative barriers that are tracked by DOL. Let's try that again, DOL. And then some of the other questions down towards the bottom, underemployed. We'll cover that. This question of underemployed on this screen doesn't have eligibility criteria tied to this question, but there is criteria in the alternative eligibility that's tied to underemployed, but those are tied to the questions we'll come up, we'll speak about in a moment. And the definition for underemployed, and this is relevant to understand, is an individual who is working part-time but desires full-time employment, or who is working in employment not commensurate with the individual's demonstrated level of educational attainment. Also, recent guidance from Department of Labor stated that if a person is working full-time, but they're on public assistance, food stamps, cash welfare, even medical card, then they should also be considered underemployed. Because what the thought process was that if you're still on public assistance, but you're working full-time, then you probably, you should receive traditional or be considered underemployed, because apparently it benefits you to receive services to get different employment to hopefully where maybe you would not need to be on the public assistance. This guidance also was in TEGL 1916 that came out from DOL, and they expanded even more on it for the underemployed. And it's really similar to the definition in a lot of local areas, self-sufficiency criteria for a dislocated worker. And it's tied to individuals who are employed, but whose current job earnings are not sufficient compared to previous job earnings from their previous employments. And there's a paragraph there that just speaks about how this is similar to that self-sufficiency criteria that's under a dislocated worker, where most times, or many times, it's based on a percentage of a client's previous wages. So we'll just use an example of 80% of a layoff wage. So if a client was making $50,000 before, and a local area's self-sufficiency criteria for a dislocated worker is for that person to receive 80% or more of the dislocation wage for self-sufficient employment, any employment taken making below that 80%. So in this example, the 40,000 or below 40,000 would still make the person considered underemployed. So in the TEGL 1916, it doesn't give these exact details. The paragraph it lists is this individual who are employed, but whose current job earnings are not sufficient compared to their previous job earnings could be considered underemployed. But it's really hard to quantify unless you have some sort of a baseline. So my recommendation would be to use your own local policy for self-sufficiency of a dislocated worker for this consideration. So on that, as again, I'd mentioned that underemployed is on this screen, but that question is not tied to eligibility, but it should be recorded accurately if a client is underemployed, because it is a barrier for federal reporting. But in this case, the client's unemployed. So if a client is unemployed, it's impossible for the client to be underemployed because you have to still be employed to be considered under.
Jim, Dina had a question about underemployed, and she just wanted to clarify that this
Sure.
definition of underemployed is for traditional dislocated workers, correct?
Yeah, there's two different things I want to make sure to pass on.
Okay.
That's the traditional dislocated worker underemployed definition. Now, part of the alternative criteria under the dislocated worker or the national dislocated worker grants, they expanded on it. And that's some of the alternative questions that we've added, the 10 of the 26 weeks non-consecutive we're going to cover here in a moment. Those are expanded on. So the definition I just covered before was from the guidance, from the federal guidance. But again, it's been expanded on even more so on these questions that you'll see in a little bit that's going to come up. But that what I just covered just now, that is the traditional underemployed definition for all clients prior to the pandemic. And did that answer your question, Dina?
Yes, she says yes. Thanks for clarifying it for me.
All right, so underemployed is tied to portions of the eligibility criteria under the dislocated worker title of displaced homemaker and also spouse of an active duty service member. However, the internal logic in IWDS is not going to be tied to that question. So again, underemployed is a portion of criteria for displaced homemaker and the spouse of an active duty service member, but it's not going to be tied to that question of underemployed that's on the employment characteristics screen. And we'll get to those categories here in a moment. So next we're going to cover is the dislocated worker characteristics screen. When you start to look at this screen, this is where you're going to see the changes that have been added for the disaster recovery as well as the employment recovery. But the top portion of the dislocated worker characteristics screen hasn't changed, or for eligibility hasn't changed. You have the top questions about required additional assistance, unemployed 6 months prior to application, completed 1 month of job search. Those three questions are tied to unlikely to return criteria. So they've been in IWDS forever. And again, they have eligibility tied to traditional unlikely to return criteria. The middle one, displaced homemaker, how logic works in IWDS is if a career planner says yes to that question, it's assumed he or she knows the definition, which we'll cover in a moment, and the eligibility would be determined. And then the spouse of an active duty service member, if that's a yes to that question, and then a yes to either employment loss due to relocation or unemployed and underemployed and experiencing difficulty in obtaining or upgrading employment, if a yes to that, it would make the client eligible under the criteria of spouse of an active duty service member. And we'll cover that in a moment also. One change that just actually happened today, in the past, the received disaster relief assistance question, it was an asterisk question, meaning it required a response. There was no eligibility, was no eligibility and is no eligibility tied to that question, and there's no reporting criteria for that question. So to avoid confusion, we've removed the asterisk from that item, so it doesn't need to be required. And there's a change ticket in IWDS that's going to actually remove that question altogether. You'll notice in the future, there's probably going to be new questions, or at least a question added tied to COVID. And for those of you who've been around a while, I don't know if you remember back when IWDS had a question related to Hurricane Katrina. It was on the WIA specific page. I presume there's going to be something similar to that, but for COVID added. Some of the middle questions, and we're going to cover more in depth, so I'm not going to go over them all. Those are questions that are going to be tied to this new alternative criteria. So let's go ahead and move on and speak in depth about that screen. So again, the first 7 questions do have eligibility tied to either unlikely return or displaced homemaker or spouse. And again, the other PowerPoint that I'll be sending out with more details is going to get really in depth on these, but we'll just go over quickly. The top 3 questions, again, are tied to unlikely to return. You'll notice they don't have asterisks, meaning they don't not required a response. So when career planners are populating those, they should really know why they're populating them, because they should only be populated if they need it for eligibility. The next question, as I mentioned, was the displaced homemaker. If it's populated with a yes, the internal logic is going to make the person eligible as a displaced homemaker. Here's the definition for a displaced homemaker. It's somebody must have been providing unpaid services to a family member and who has been dependent on the income of another family member, but is no longer supported by that family member, by the income of that member, and is unemployed or underemployed, experiencing difficulty in obtaining or upgrading employment. Traditionally, what you look for folks in this is maybe a stay-at-home spouse who got divorced, or their spouse passed away, or maybe the traditional person lost his or her job. That's traditionally who meets the displaced homemaker. The spouse of an active duty service member, this was added under the WIOA legislation. On this, the intent was, I spent 20 years in the Air Force, and I moved every 3 to 4 years. So when you're married, it is tough on your spouse when you're moving every 3 to 4 years to get a career going. So they put in this criteria. And the initial intent was, if a spouse lost their job when he or she was moving to follow their spouse that's in the armed forces, they would meet eligibility. But then they even broadened it to if you're a spouse of somebody that's in the military and you're just unemployed or underemployed and experiencing difficulty in obtaining or upgrading employment, you would be eligible also. So it doesn't have to be associated with the move. So either you lose your employment because you've moved with your spouse, or you just lost your employment and having a hard time regaining employment is another characteristic for that. But again, it's only tied to spouses of folks in the military. And then if there's a no to the question of spouse of service member, then the other 2, A and B, should not be answered. And the logic would tell a person that if they try to put an answer in A or B, if you have a no, internal logic won't let you. And then, as I mentioned, as of today, the asterisk item was removed off that question of received disaster relief assistance. The reason why we did that, because there's really no clarification on exactly what should be answered to that. If you think about it, we're all, or many of us, received recovery money. So would that be appropriate for this answer, or should it be something else? So since there really is no DOL guidance on that, that's usually why we're elected to not require this question. And then again, it is going to go away in the future changes. And I expect to see some new questions tied more to COVID with more details when DOL gives us exactly what they want us to ask for this. It wouldn't be for eligibility, it'd be more for reporting and data tracking, I would envision. So now we're going to get into the actual questions that have been added for the alternative criteria. So I do want to make this clear. If your client would have already met any traditional dislocated worker, then they shouldn't bother with these new 4 questions. These should only be populated for clients who do not meet traditional dislocated worker. And these are the 4 questions. Client has no work history. Was client unemployed or underemployed for 10 non-consecutive weeks out of the last 26? In the last 24 months, client held or is currently holding a temporary or seasonal job. And then the last 24 months, has the client's employment ended more than once? These questions were put together based on that overall Fed definition of how to cover that criteria in questions that can meet eligibility. So that's what these were put together. A yes to any one of these questions is going to make the client eligible under the alternative disasters, emergencies and disasters criteria, where your 1 DR grant is located. So again, I'm going to reiterate, if the client's already met traditional dislocated worker, or if he or she would, you should leave these questions alone. What I can see could happen is people could say, hey, this is a lot easier than having to get paperwork on unemployment, or having to get whether the job's declining or low growth. I can just say yes to one of these and my client will be eligible. But then you're not going to get an accurate reading of this client of truly his or her circumstances, because you're pigeonholing them only into this alternative criteria. And then he or she is going to be restricted from being able to get services under other grants, because you're still going to, if you meet traditional dislocated worker, you're going to get the services under the DR grant, but then the client's still open for any of your other formula grants and things like that. Where if you just use this alternative criteria, you're not going to be able to get services under the other grants that you might have in your local area. And this just speaks about and I know Mike Pierman had a question earlier about this. Client has no work history. So if a client comes in and he or she has no work history, when they're certified, you're only going to be eligible in the disasters and recoveries or emergencies, disasters. And so if your grant is the DR grant, then the only way the client can get services is under that DR. When that funding runs out, when it just runs its course, if you've used it all up, then the client would not have any other service opportunities. Where if he or she is co-enrolled under a traditional dislocated worker, you'd have those options. But if they have no work history, then there would be no other dislocated worker. The next question: was client unemployed or underemployed for 10 non-consecutive weeks out of the last 26? So basically what you're looking at, any time during the last 6 months, did they have 10 weeks that they were unemployed or underemployed? This is where that underemployed definition comes into play. So again, a yes to that. Now for my mock client that I made here, she was the one that lost her job or got out of the military, got a job, and got fired in December of 2019. She meets this criteria here. Was she unemployed or unemployed for the last 10 of the last 26 non-consecutive weeks? So that's how she ended up meeting the alternative eligibility. In the last 24 months, client held or is currently holding a temporary or seasonal job. So again, somebody working part-time, somebody that it's not their real job or full-time job, forever job. It's just what they're doing right now because that's what they need to do. And then the last one is in the last 24 months, has client's employment ended more than once? So what this is tied to is if a client lost his or her job, got fired, got laid off, quit even more than one time, they would meet eligibility. A lot of times what you're going to find is a client might meet multiple of these criteria. Only one takes a yes to meet eligibility. If you say yes to more than one, it's fine. You just need to make sure that your documentation, which in most cases is probably going to be a self-attestation, covers each of the circumstances that a yes has been marked in. So if a client meets any traditional dislocated worker, I know it sounds like a drum when I keep beating this thing over and over. When they're certified under 1D, 1E, 1N, 1S, 1DC, 1EC. So they're going to be eligible under your disaster recovery grants. But if a client is only determined eligible under the alternative DR eligibility criteria, their enrollment in services will be restricted to just the DR grants. And it doesn't give an opportunity to co-enroll in any other LWF formula grants. So it's really a primary reason that we want to make sure that you're certifying folks under the traditional DW, but also for tracking, you want to make sure to get a valid snapshot of your client base. So if you make all your clients eligible under alternative criteria, it would make it appear that you guys really didn't have any traditional dislocated worker that needed services. So again, for data integrity, as well as doing what's right by your customer, you want to use traditional eligibility where it's appropriate and only use the alternative criteria when the client would not be traditional dislocated worker.
Jim, if I could jump in for just a second, just to
Sure.
reiterate that or stress it. Yeah, for the two reasons in particular, the data integrity, in other words, when we run reports, we would hope to see the vast majority of people, enrolled in the disaster project that meets dislocated worker criteria. I mean, there's not a requirement, but we would like to see that. But the other thing is, we talked about co-enrollment. And just to explain up front, you may have no intention of co-enrolling someone down the road. You're thinking, they're eligible as a dislocated worker, but I'm going to put them in as a, long-term unemployed because it's easier or quicker. Again, we want you to certify them as a dislocated worker whenever they're eligible and they meet that criteria. Again, you may not have any intention of co-enrolling them. You think it's short and sweet and, they're just going to possibly do disaster relief employment. but you just never know how things are going to play out. And if funding runs out, or it turns out they do want the full complement of employment and training services and you've run out, whatever reason, or the grant is getting ready to end, and so you're up against a deadline, or the funding has run out for many reasons, we do want you to certify someone as a dislocated worker each and every time that they meet that criteria. Thanks, Jim.
Yep. All right. And I am touching on the employment recovery a little bit just because there's a question that's been added to this screen. So in the middle, this question, and again, I'll end up creating a separate PowerPoint for the employment recovery, but this was the alternative criteria. And I don't know if we'll have a whole lot of people that'll meet it, but if a Department of Defense contract employee who is a non-managerial, who's at risk of termination due to defense reductions resulting in a contractor's conversion of operations from defense to non-defense. So it's a long old definition, but that's part of an alternative criteria for the ER. And again, this PowerPoint's not touching on it, but since the question was added to the dislocated worker characteristic screen, I didn't want to ignore it. Now let's get back to the DR eligibility to make sure everybody understands. Internal logic in IWDS is looking beyond the eligibility for these questions also. And what these are going to be tied to are the disaster relief employment experiences or services that's planned for the clients. On this, so let's say you have a client that you're not going to be putting in disaster relief employment, well then you just put not required for these answers. But if he or she is going to go into a disaster relief employment, that's when you'd want to make sure you're accurately recording what's going on with these questions. So on this, the question's asking about physical. You have yes, past physical, yes, failed physical, not required for the job. Here's a hard stop. If you put yes, failed physical, it's going to affect the eligibility. The client's not going to show up as eligible under the alternative DR criteria. So you have to make sure that if the person fails the physical, and if you're not going to put him in that job that did require the physical, then you'd want to update your answer for not required for the job. So you need to make sure folks are thinking about those types of things. Same for received disaster or tetanus shots. Yes, they've had a shot. It's not required for the shot due to had a recent tetanus shot in the last 12 months, or not required from the job. The received background check. Yes, passed background check. Yes, failed background check, not required. If you put yes, failed background check, it's a stop. So when it comes time for eligibility, you're going to notice the client's not eligible under the alternative criteria. And if they're traditionally under traditional dislocated worker, when they try to enroll in the disaster relief employment, they're going to get stopped. So it's important to make sure that that's updated appropriately based on the job he or she's going to go into. And then receive drug screening. Yes, past drug screening. Yes, failed drug screening, not required. If the person failed the drug screening and that's your answer in there, it's going to not pass the logic for the alternative to eligibility criteria. And if the person's certified under traditional dislocated worker, it's not going to let him or her be put in the disaster relief employment service. So these screens have eligibility. They don't have eligibility tied to it, but there is internal logic to these responses. So it's important that staff understand that.
Jim, can
in all cases,
go ahead.
Let me just finish this last thought. In all cases, there is an option of not required for the job or not required, but that should only be used based on the circumstances of the job. We wouldn't want to bypass the logic and say, hey, we're going to put not required, even though my client is required to have the background check or the drug screening. All right, Jill.
Yeah, Mike had asked a question about a participant may not have taken the background check prior to certification or completed a physical until after certification. So if I can jump in with this, as far as these 4 questions that are here, the intent was for disaster relief employment, locally for each and every work site, what is required. In some cases, a physical isn't required. or a tetanus shot isn't required. These are quite often, the physical and tetanus shot are generally for the labor intensive, you know, the flood, the tornado kinds of jobs. But anyway, you locally and your case managers would need to understand this in terms of what is or isn't required. So if you are putting somebody in disaster relief employment and a background check is required or a physical is required, then you would need to be indicating that here. It's understood that sometimes that delays this process in terms of making someone eligible. So typically, as I understand it, the process is that you've got somebody who you want to put into the program, you've got a work site you want to match them up to. Let's say that work site requires a drug test and a background check. And so you line that up for them before you finish the certification. So you're not doing this after you certify them. If you know up front that it's required, then you do that prior to certification. And if it comes back that they failed the drug test, then you would indicate that. So to get back to Mike's question, the intent here is that you would be doing these things, anything that's required for a work site, for a worker to show up and do the work there, to be eligible to go to do the work, is done prior to certification. Mike, you can let me know if that addresses your question. And then related to that, Dina was asking about, and we'll get back to Mike if he's got any follow-up, but what happens if we pay for a physical, they fail, and we cannot certify eligibility? Can we still be reimbursed for the cost of the physical? So, you know, we want to explain that, yes, all of these costs are considered, you know, pre-employment or pre-enrollment because they have to be done prior to someone being eligible for a work site. So yes, you can pay for those, and it's just a matter of you documenting those, having a system locally. We're suggesting, and Jim might get into this later, but in your case notes, we want you to indicate in your case notes for each and every participant what it is that you're providing in terms of these pre-employment activities. So you would have Mary Smith, and you would indicate that you know, what you paid for in terms of a physical, a background check, whatever it is, and you could indicate, you know, the outcome of that, whatever it is, but there's a paper trail then. The other thing that many OEAs have done, and I would recommend, is that they set up a spreadsheet just to keep track of this, because some of you have many work sites, is that you would set up a spreadsheet that shows the various, I should say, applicants, and indicate, you know, what it is in terms of the different columns, if it's a background check, drug screening, whatever it is, and that you would mark those off or indicate what the status is. That would help you keep track of it, because it can get quite cumbersome. But it also helps tie in for monitoring purposes, for auditing, tying in the costs and who it was you were paying these for. Because in some cases, you're right, they're not going to end up becoming participants. And here you've spent money, grant funds, on a non-participant, which generally is an issue. It's a problem. But in this case, you would have the documentation through case notes in this spreadsheet to support that you spent money on, even if they're just an applicant and they end up not being enrolled. And then Mike goes on to ask, that would mean we would have a file waiting for final certification for the time needed to get test results. If that is okay with the state, then that is what we'll do. So yes, that happens. And I know there's many people on the phone who on the front lines with this and have done this for other projects, floods, whatever it might be. And yes, that's what I understand happens, is that you've got a person you want to put into a job. You've talked to the work site, you know, it's what they want. Everybody's a go, but you do have to do the drug screening, for example, and everything kind of gets put on hold. You get the results and then you can move forward. Yes, you can enroll them and they can get started to work, or they aren't enrolled and you have to look for another person. So yes, it can slow things down, because you do have to wait for that information, background check, drug screening, whatever it is. And then, you know, you would indicate that there, and then you could move forward. And Michelle is chiming in and saying, yes, that happens very frequently. We had a flood grant. And let me just mention, since we're talking about this, feel free, and I'm encouraging everybody to share peer-to-peer and to reach out to other LWIAs to ask questions about their own experience. Could be related to this as far as drug tests. I know we've had problems with that in the past where we thought we had participants that were going to be a go, and then they failed the drug test, or in some cases a background check. And then we had to go back to square one, and the LWIA had to find somebody else. And Robert's question, do all fields need to be filled out? Yes, for those 4 questions, you have to have a response in each and every one. It might be that you're indicating not required or not required for job title, but yes, every one of those questions do need a response. I'm just checking here, Jim.
No problem.
Okay, we'll get back to a question here in a minute that Michelle asked back on alternative eligibility. I missed it when we were talking about that, so remind me, but that's all we have right now dealing with this criteria, this pre-employment criteria.
All right. Well, that question, when we get ready to do certification, will probably be a good time to address that, because it kind of shows the eligibility certifications. That there's probably questions around that time anyway, so that'll work out.
Thanks.
So for this mock client, as I mentioned, she wouldn't have met traditional dislocated worker criteria, but she did meet the alternative criteria, was unemployed or underemployed for 10 non-consecutive weeks out of the last 26 weeks. So when it comes time to do her eligibility, we know she's going to meet that criteria. And then if you look down below, for physical, she was not required. She had a tetanus shot, and for the background check and drug screening was not required. So just me looking at this, I know as long as she's authorized to work in the United States that she's going to be eligible under the 1N eligibility criteria, or under the emergencies and disasters criteria, because she has one of those 4 checked, and the questions at the bottom have responses that are going to be suitable, either not required or they've passed. So on this case, in this particular case, even though this client has met that alternative criteria, I also wanted to demonstrate some of the other alternative criteria. This particular client, she doesn't have a dislocation job, but I'm going to show you now for a mock client who's maybe who is self-employed, or who is self-employed and they've lost, they're considered now more underemployed because their business has slowed down. So I'm going to show you how that can be recorded in IWDS. So you'd go to the traditional list job screen. In this case, it was Betty's Boutique. She was the owner, and it closed down. So if you read into the details, it talks about, for the alternatives criteria under the DR grant, other eligibility with an IWDS would be if a client who owned a business and that business closed due to flood or other natural disaster, which under this case, the COVID falls into that criteria. So in the adjacent screen, this demonstrated a client whose own business, which was primary occupation due to flood or natural disaster, closed. So some of the things for internal logic, it would have primary occupation would be a yes, self-employed a yes, dislocation a yes, and then flood or natural disaster. Those are things, and it's going to get picked up under the 1N alternative criteria for emergency disasters due to this. Here's an example of a client who owns her own business, but the business is not closed, but she's considered underemployed. So everything's the same down below, but the employment status is threatened with layoff. So if it's populated with threatened with layoff, it's also going to get picked up as alternate eligibility under the emergency disasters, which is where that DR grant is. And there's another one that if you work for a farmer or a rancher or a fish hatchery, this eligibility could come into play. And it's based on down the lower right corner, you see where it says family member farmhand. This came up a lot recently in our flood grants, in LWIA 21 and LWIA 22. People that worked for farmers lost their jobs due to the floods. So in this case, they were able to record them under this alternative eligibility criteria. And again, these are probably more outliers for some areas that might not run into this, but it is part of the eligibility criteria for the alternatives. So for this PowerPoint, I only added that dislocation job to demonstrate how eligibility under the alternative criteria could be met when an individual has lost their job or became underemployed due to emergencies, disasters. Now, if a client had responded yes to any of those other 4 one-in alternative questions that have been added on the dislocated worker characteristics screen, the client would not be required to put that dislocation job. So I just want to make sure we're clear on that. So just to reiterate, if you meet traditional dislocated worker, you should be populating the dislocated worker or the dislocation job. But if you do not meet dislocated worker traditional criteria, you have the 4 questions, but also if you own the business and you have that, that's what I demonstrated, or if you work for a farmer or something. But if you really think about it, even the person that owned their own business could probably still answer yes to one of those 4 alternative questions. So, but we wanted to make sure to show you all the possible alternative criteria that's built into IWDS that meets the threshold of the Department of Labor definition.
Jim, if I could jump in, this ties in with, Michelle was just asking, if for some reason a client's determined eligible only for one in DR alternatives, so these 4 criteria you were mentioning, that they were determined eligible under one of those, but weeks later they discovered that they are a dislocated worker and they might want to enroll them in 1D. So is there a way to address that so that they can enroll them in 1D?
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
They would have to work with me independent, because the application, once it's certified, it locks all the circumstances of that. So,
sure.
So I'm trying to think on the outside how it would later be determined unless they're using an employment that they didn't initially list. So it'd have to be worked individually. The system wouldn't be able to do it. I'd work with them, and it would probably have to update the original application to record what was applicable, because you got to keep in mind the application is a snapshot of what's going on with the client at time of application. So when his or her certification is done, it's locking that eligibility criteria. So if a circumstance happens later, it wouldn't have made him or her eligible back then. They might be eligible now as a dislocated worker, but then it would be tied to the job that they've been working at is under the 1N. So we'd have to look at the circumstances to see if it would be relevant to open up or to modify application, or what are the circumstances for it. If she has a good example, it would help me probably register it in my mind. And she doesn't have to have it right now. If she wants to send it to me, I'd be glad to give her any feedback on it also.
Okay. Thanks, Jim. And one other thing then tied to one of these 4 criteria is self-attestation. Mike was asking if self-attestation is okay for the self-employed.
Yeah, because if you just think about it, in a lot of this alternative criteria, there's not going to be that formal documentation, because, so you'll get to see it when we go to determine eligibility. It'll have the choices of documentation. So a lot of it is work history or applicant statement is a lot of the documentation. So if there is no traditional documentation for it, we're limited a lot of times to self-attestations or / work history. So depending on the circumstances, if that's all it is, that's what would be appropriate.
Thank you.
Yep. Other important alternative or important information, any individual who meets that traditional dislocated worker, again, should be certified underneath that. So we've touched on that before. The next portion of the family characteristics screen in the application, we owe a definition of family, but to keep in mind, there's no eligibility criteria that's tied to the family member for the DR, for the emergencies and disasters criteria. And then for dislocated worker, the only portion of eligibility that might be tied to family could be a displaced homemaker or spouse of an active duty service member. So keeping in mind that when you're looking to record family, it only needs to be recorded in a WEO application if it's relevant for the criteria of eligibility. So in most of the cases, the family, it's just going to be the client self-attested, and they won't need to list all the family members. So as this paragraph says, please understand the WEO application IWDS is just that, the application to make a client qualified, and the family only needs to be recorded in this part of the application if the family is being utilized for eligibility criteria. So for this mock client, she is single with no children, and so she chose to report not reported. Keep in mind, there is no criteria that's tied to the family type. A lot of time we get questions about the family type when why do they say not reported or not family? It's just a choice that's up there. There's half a dozen choices, and for somebody that's a single person, you either have not reported or not a family. So that's, but again, there's no eligibility criteria tied to the family type. And there is no eligibility tied to the family size for dislocated worker or any of the alternative criteria. Where that comes into play traditionally is for income calculations. That's where the family size comes into really important for the adult title and the youth title. In this case, family of one due to disability, that's also comes into play for income calculations. In this case, the client's going to be a dislocated worker, or in this case, the alternative eligibility, because she doesn't meet traditional dislocated worker. So the family of one due to disability is not applicable for her eligibility. The WEO training criteria screen, if the client's going to go into training services, in order to be certified into training, you'd have to complete that WEO training criteria screen. This PowerPoint then doesn't touch on that. The other one that I'll send out after the webinar goes in depth about that. So now we're going to look at the client's application's been completed. So now you have application dates and eligibility dates. The application date can be any date on or after that original contact date. So if you remember back, my original contact date was 6/1/20. So the application date would need to be on or after that date. This is also relevant for your grants. You know, you got to look when your grant was dated. I think all of them were July or June. Was it June 1st or July 1st, Jill, for these grants?
June 1st.
So June 1st. So at the earliest you could have anybody enrolled in a service would be June 1st. You couldn't do any date prior to that because your grant wasn't relevant or wasn't out there until that date. For this mock client, I had an application date of 7/1/20, an eligibility date of 7/1/20. The eligibility doesn't have to be on the same date as the application date. It can be any date between the application date and 30 days after. When eligibility is determined, what you're going to notice when an eligibility certification is done, this client's going to be eligible for a lot of adult titles also, just because of their circumstances. Because if you're over age 18, and if you're authorized to work in the United States, if you're a female, you're eligible under the adult title. So if she meets any of the basic skills deficiencies, she can be under the priorities of adult. If she could meet any criteria of low income, it'd be adult low income. But those grants aren't, or those titles aren't relevant for the one DR. That's only under the dislocated worker or the alternative criteria. So just because a client is eligible for all those others, unless you tend to enroll him or her in one of those other grants or programs, you wouldn't need to certify under that. So for this mock client, as I mentioned, she shows up as career services for adult, BSD career training, BSD training, low income career and training. And then the dislocated worker due to emergencies and disasters, she also met the opioid criteria. Keep in mind the opioid logic is in all LWIAs, but the grants are only held under LWIA 90. So it does you no good to certify under the opioid criteria just because you see a client meeting that criteria. So for this particular mock client, we're wanting to serve her under our disaster recovery grants, and that would fall under the emergencies and disasters criteria. So that's when we need to look at our documentation for those. This particular client, again, we're not interested in certifying under the adult title. We're not interested in certifying under the one-in opioid title because, again, those grants are housed under LWIA 90 for those opioid grants. The client does not meet any traditional dislocated worker. This is where if they did meet traditional dislocated workers, where he or she should be certified, but she does not meet that eligibility. So we have criteria and documentation. When you're looking at the screens, criteria explains the whys, why somebody meets certain eligibility criteria. So if you click on it, you'll see the yeses. By yes, she's authorized to work. Compliant with selected service, she's a yes because she's not required to. In this case, the client is a vet. That's not eligibility factor. It has yes, that she meets all the criteria for the physical fitness and the background and the drug. And then it shows why she met the alternatives criteria. In this case, the client was unemployed or underemployed for 10 of the last 26 weeks. So that's what met her criteria. So if you ever wonder why a client met or did not meet criteria, you can always click into the criteria screen. And how you find the criteria screen for something a client does not meet it for, if you hit show all subgroups, it gives you a big old laundry list of all the programs, and you can click in to see why somebody may have not met eligibility if you think they should have. For this case, the specific documentation that we're going to be using for the clients. So we click in, you got to do authorized to work in the United States. So any of the traditional documentation that could be used. It's not applicable for selective service. For her, she was a vet, so we had a DD-214. And then you may not be able to see it very well, but it talks about was client unemployed or underemployed for 10 of the last 26 weeks. So two choices of documentation are applicant statement or work history. So if you think about it, it's almost one and the same because the client would be listing their work history under an applicant statement. So what you'll find is for the no work history, it's an applicant statement for in the last 24 months held or is holding a temp or seasonal job. It's going to be work history applicant statement. And the same for in the last 24 months says employment ended more than once. So here's a complete screen of the client's eligibility documentation populated. Here's the one for emergency disasters for certification and training. You have to prove that you've had an assessment, you have an IEP, the client meets qualifications for a training program, training program's demand and other grant sources unavailable. Again, you'd only need this if the client was intended to go into training. In my case, for this mock client, she was intended to go into both disaster relief employment as well as traditional dislocated worker for training. That's the reason why I recorded assessment tests, and the other PowerPoint, the longer version, has that, the step-by-step for that. Certification dates, it's really important you understand that certification, all documentation must be dated on or prior to whatever that certification date is. The career planner chooses the certification date. So in order to get there, you have to pick the titles that you're going to certify, and you've only moved there if you've put the documentation in. You come up to the certification screen. It says, I have reviewed the eligibility criteria for the title or program along with the required documents and certify the above named customer is eligible. It has to be switched from a no to a yes. Once it's switched over to a yes about that statement, this is the certification date. It's really the most important date. When a monitor comes out, they need to make sure everything is signed and dated on or prior to whatever this certification date. So that's really the most important drop dead date. If all of a sudden we certify right now, because right now the client's an inquirent, as soon as I hit that next button, it makes the client an applicant and it locks the application. So right now I could still go back and change anything in the application. As soon as I hit next, the record gets locked. So we want to make sure that everything's signed and dated on or prior to whatever date that we put in here. If all of a sudden the record's certified and there's something eligibility based and it's dated the 9th of July when we certified them on the 2nd, a monitor is probably going to have problems with it. So after the statement is read and you click on that certificate or put the certification date and hit next, the client's certified. So now they're in applicant status, meaning the record's locked. You got up to 45 days to put them in services. Typically, we're going to enroll them in services right away, hopefully. We add enrolled services. Here's where it's important to know some of the little details. Now, one of the things about the certification under the one disasters and or emergencies and disasters, we also have those flood grants I've talked about. Hold on, I've got a call trying to come in. Let me decline that. All right, I'm back. The emergencies and disasters grants that LWIA 21 and LWIA 22 has are under the 1E title. So when we certify somebody under any emergencies and disasters, you're going to notice for the title, it's going to show both the 1E and the 1N. Now your emergencies or your disaster recovery grant is under the 1N title. So you need to make sure staff are picking the appropriate title. Your grant's under 1N, they must pick the one in grant for the title, or else your grant's not going to show up. In some instances, an LWIA might have multiple one in grants. I know that there's some other grants out. LWIA 1, I know, has some one in grants besides the disaster recovery. So it's really important if you have an alternative other one in that staff understand what grant they're picking. The disaster recovery in there is disaster recovery. So again, make sure staff understand the grants they're picking. In some instances, some local areas are going to have both the disaster recovery and the employment recovery grant. So it's really important staff understand which grant they're enrolling clients in. So this is where that attention to detail is going to come into play, of making sure staff understand your grants. The next is your providers, choosing the provider. Here's one of the things: your local systems administrator at each LWIA sets up your provider relationships. So for all the provider relationships for the disaster recovery and the employment recovery, it's going to be set up under the one in title. Some of the details, though, the disaster employment is under the disaster recovery grant. That service can't be under the employment recovery. So that's something separate. We'll get into it during that PowerPoint, but these are a lot of really important details that make sure staff understand if you have both of those grants to select the appropriate one. For the providers of the services of disaster relief employment, this is one of the things we want to make sure everybody's clear on also. For the provider relationships for that disaster relief employment service, you would use whatever your traditional local area uses for your provider, for all your other traditional services, case management, development, IEP, those sort of, for the overall provider relationship. And then you'd want to make sure that the employer was populated by the work location or work site the individual is going to go into. Some other details when you're recording that service of disaster relief employment. It's really important that in the comment box that it's recorded the job title that the person's going to go into. What we're going to need this for is there's going to be reports ran, and when they need to try to figure out the different job titles are people going to receive, we're going to have our programmers run reports, and it's going to be pulling information out of the comments block, but it's going to only be looking at the first certain number of characters within the comment blocks. So here's an example. For a client, the provider was the traditional dislocated worker or the traditional LWIA's provider. The hours of employment was populated, the wages was populated, the employer was populated, and in the comment section, in this particular case, the person's job is going to be a contact tracer. So again, to reiterate, make sure staff are putting in the job title in the first comment of the comment section. It doesn't have an asterisk on IWDS, so it's not going to require it for the internal logic, but the grant manager, Jill Meskey, is going to require this. So if it happens where staff don't record it, she's going to end up reaching out, or somebody will reach out and say, hey, we need that comment section to include the job title of the client's going to be doing at that employment and disaster relief employment.
This is Jill. Can I jump in, Jim? Can you hear me?
Oh, most definitely.
Okay.
Most definitely, please do.
With the prior screen, if we can go back there a second, the one thing, and I know you mentioned this, I just wanted to stress it, is the item asterisk marked employer. That is the work site where the person is working. It's not the employer of record, which might be the LWIA or a staffing agency. What we want there, because we're going to run reports on all this, we want to know where the person is working. So if it's the YMCA or the food bank or whatever it is, that's what goes there. And then contact tracer, yes, Jim explained that. And so those are all important elements that we'll be running reports on that we need to know. But then also we'll be sharing with DOL. Thank you. Yep.
The next for enrollment services, one of the things I want to cover right now in IWDS, there's a change request in, and there's going to be a new service level. So right now you'll notice that the disaster relief employment is showing up under career services. But in this new IWDS change request, there's going to be a level of service called disaster recovery services, and that's where the disaster relief employment's going to be under, and that's also where the service of disaster relief safety training is going to be under. And also underneath this new service level, there's going to be disaster relief supportive services. So until the time the disaster relief safety training and the disaster relief supportive services come about, you need to case note if those are done. If you're providing disaster relief supportive services, or if you're providing disaster relief safety training, you'd want to case note the who, what, whens, why, hows. And that's what it speaks about in this next slide. So again, the disaster recovery services are going to be added into IWDS. Our programmers are working on them right now as we're speaking about. I put an expected completion date of mid-August. I'm hoping for even quicker than that, because I know our primary programmer is working on it today because he had questions on it. So again, that's where, once it's in, that's where the disaster relief employment will show up. That's where the disaster relief safety training will show up, and that's where the supportive services related to disaster relief employment will show up. And the important things about those is that's what's going to keep them out of your performance outcomes for your LWIA, because it's underneath that new service level that's not associated with traditional career and training services. So right now you have no choice but to put the disaster relief employment under the career services, because that's how it is in IWDS. So we'll make an automated switch when we transfer over to the disaster relief or disaster recovery services, to your disaster relief employment will get switched over, and then that's where you'll find the new safety training and those disaster relief supportive services. So until that time, again, you're going to be case noting basically the who, what, whens about the safety training, and for any of your supportive services, the who, what, when, where, and why types of supportive services. So you'd want that information in just for your own staff also when they're going to go back and date those, because they're going to be going back and putting them in as services relevant to when they did occur once those services, those changes get put into IWDS. So this is a couple of really important little details to make sure staff understand. Again, disaster relief safety training is allowable under the disaster recovery, and it's going to keep people out of performance with that service, along with disaster relief employment and those disaster relief supportive services. And again, those supportive services under this would be tied to the disaster relief employment and tied to and/or the disaster relief safety training. So until those new services get in, to make sure to case note those. As a reminder, if a client receives services related to disaster relief employment only, such as disaster relief employment, disaster relief safety training, and supportive services related to disaster relief employment or safety training, then the individual would not fall under the LWIA's performance outcomes. If the individual is enrolled in any other services under the DR grant, the client will go into the performance outcomes. To recap again, this is the DOL definition that we were given for the eligibility, and then we took this definition and we built in the alternative criteria under 2, 3, and 4. One is the traditional dislocated worker, which we hope again that if any client meets that eligibility, you guys do have your staff certify under that. But if it's any of the alternative eligibility, that's when they would use the criteria that's outlined in this PowerPoint. So in IWDS, if a client meets any traditional DW, certify them there. If they don't, that's when the alternative comes into play. So now you've seen an application created in IWDS. This application encompassed an emergencies and disasters application, which includes that disaster recovery 1N grant. The eligibility determined on the 1E emergency and disaster application was certified eligible. And then the demonstration of the enrollment in the service of disaster relief employment under the 1N disaster recovery grants. If you have questions about anything in this PowerPoint, feel free to reach out to me either by email or calling me. If you have any specifics about the the DR grants, Jill is a better resource. I only know what she teaches me or what she's taught me. So if I don't know it, or if I'm not even 100% sure, I would always be reaching out to her. So she's the expert on any function that's outside of IWDS you need to answer. I can answer anything related to the application or how IWDS logics work and those sort of things. So any other questions in there, Jill?
Yeah, let me jump in with a few things. One is with certifying, you had shown a while back the screen where there's all those boxes you can check as far as certifying. And you had mentioned emergencies, disasters, one in career services and training. And you had mentioned early on that if somebody's just going to go into disaster relief employment, you don't need to do training. You don't need to check that box. But is there a downside with checking that? Because what we don't know, the whole thing, you know, is going to possibly take twists and evolve, and somebody might later decide they do want the employment training service. So I would encourage people, unless there's a reason not to indicate career services and training services. What's your thought on that, Jim?
Well, here's the tricky thing about that.
Okay.
If the client is certified up to training services, there has to be a formal assessment and a formal IEP completed. So if you're thinking about keeping the person out of performance, the service of a development IEP is a service needed to go into training. So they should wait until they're for sure they want to put the person in training, or their intent is to put the person in training before they do that, just because we don't want them to put them in performance outcomes if they're not going to put them in those other services.
Right.
But if you know, like my PowerPoint, the full-blown PowerPoint, it was known this client was going to go into training services because she had taken the assessment test, had done all the steps. So she had the formal IEP done. So that's the only downside to certifying into training is the expectation, or not the expectation, the requirement is the full-blown assessment, to where just for career services, it's a much truncated version. It doesn't have to be the full-blown recorded assessment, which would be a career service outside of those traditional disaster relief employment services. And
by just checking career services, then at a later time, 6 months down the road, for example, they could indicate training.
The next day. They can do it anytime on or after that certification date. Those can be updated at any time, even if a year later, as long as the client's still open and hasn't been exited, they can certify into training and move forward with that. So, and that happens a lot in real world time. You know, sometimes the client comes in, he or she doesn't want to go into training, so they don't believe they need it, but after a while they end up becoming eligible for training. So it happens often later. So it's probably the exception that a person gets certified at the career and training at the same time, a lot of times for a dislocated worker.
Okay.
But it is available. It's just we want to make sure everybody understands, if you enroll somebody in a service of development of an IEP, you're going to put them in performance just by that service alone. So that's a service that's outside of the disaster recovery services.
Yeah, and the one thing I do want to stress to everyone is, I know there's a lot of thinking that there's going to be a number of participants who only want disaster relief employment and they don't want the full complement of employment training services. So yes, you might be starting out with someone that way, and limiting your enrolled services to those 3 that Jim had been discussing. And as he said, you need to, add the comments in the case notes to explain everything that's going on. That does include, everybody is required to have some kind of an assessment, even if they're just going into disaster relief. It's not the full IEP. And I know Mike was asking about, for disaster work only, no IEP is required. Correct. And we don't want you to enter an IEP, because that would put somebody into performance when they don't need to be or shouldn't be. So everybody does need to be assessed from the standpoint of, you need to find out what their skills and interests are for the disaster relief job. In other words, matching them up and making sure they're qualified to go to that work site. You also need to do an assessment so you can find out what their needs are in terms of supportive services. So the case notes it would be where you document and explain the assessment that you did. So no, it's not a full IEP and you're not indicating an IEP service, but you are putting in case notes that yes, you did assess the person, skills, interest, supportive service needs. So I wanted to explain that. That was a question that Mike had about no IEP is required, correct. The other thing I was going to explain about this evolving is that the expectation is with this project is the ultimate goal is to help people find permanent employment. And so, you know, we do want you to provide the employment and training services to anybody and everybody who wants that service. So in other words, if somebody comes in at the beginning and says, I just want this disaster relief job, and that's all, I don't need your other services, but then 6 months later that changes and they do want the service, then we would need to provide, you know, the full employment training services, whatever it is that helps them obtain permanent employment. So I just want to stress that goal with this project is that it is to help people obtain permanent employment. And of course, the other goal is to help the communities in impacting the COVID pandemic. There was a question about, will we need to document safety training or equipment training, or are case notes enough?
That's the piggyback off. Right now, you would case note it, but in the real near future, there'll be a new service that it'll be under those disaster recovery service level, and there'll be a service for disaster relief safety training. So right now, case note it, but make sure you have those details of who, what, when, where, including the dates and things like that. So you can have staff go back and record the actual service to be accurate to when it occurred. And that's the same thing we want you to do with those disaster relief supportive services that a client's receiving. Don't put them in right now under traditional career service supportive services. Case note it. If they're only tied to your disaster relief employment, case note it, because we'll want to record those under the disaster relief supportive services.
You know, that reminds me of something, and I just to make sure I understand this, is that with those items that we're calling pre-employment activities requirements or pre-enrollment, the drug screening, the background check, those are not considered supportive services. And I'm thinking that those are just in the case notes and of course on the spreadsheet that I mentioned. So if you're if somebody is going through a drug test or a physical, whatever it is, don't show that as a supportive service, because it's not. It's just something to case note and that we would track. And then related to that, because it's a supportive service question, is that Dina was asking about supportive services. Should any supportive service, transportation, childcare, etc., be reported under the new DR service code? And can the DR support service be the first enrolling service? So my thoughts on that is we now have two types of supportive services category, in that any supportive service provided to someone to participate in the disaster relief employment activity, if it's childcare, transportation, work clothing for that disaster job, whatever it is that helps them participate in that disaster relief job, should be under that new code that's being developed, disaster relief employment supportive services. And then if, for example, they go on and get employment and training services and you're providing supportive services for them to go to training, then you would use the regular supportive services code that you're used to using in your regular employment training services. Does that sound right, Jim?
Yeah, but I think the question is, I think what Dina was asking about is, could that disaster relief supportive services be the first service? Meaning, could you have that prior to having a disaster relief employment? Is that what you were asking, Dina?
Yeah, that's her second question. Can the DR support?
What you explained about the first, the original, let me just finish answering your question first then, Jill, before I jump to the second one. Yes, if a person is going to receive traditional services outside of disaster relief, that's when they would record those traditional supportive services. If they're going to receive just the disaster relief services, and that's what their supportive services, they should be case noted, and then when the new services come in, recorded under the new disaster relief supportive services. Now, for the question, the second part of Dina's, I'll rely on you to give me that feedback, because that's the answers. I'll have to make sure the programmer's logic's built in, because how it works traditionally is you cannot use a supportive service as your first service, because you have to have another service in order to receive a supportive services. But I don't know what your answer is going to be on Dina's question there. So
this ties into disaster relief employment. And of course, we're limited to this disaster relief employment, the job itself, the safety training or supportive services. And Dina's asking about supportive services being the first. So that might mean that somebody needs disaster relief, the work clothing to report to the job. Or so I guess, and I'm not sure about the logic of this, Jim, how the system is being built, but that could be the case for disaster relief employment, that somebody, yes, their first activity before they report to the job for the first day of work could be that they need to get the work clothing to do that. Or it could be that the first is the disaster relief employment, or maybe it's related safety training that they have to do before they can go to the job. But maybe that's something we need to check on, Jim, to make sure the system, the logic is built that for the disaster relief, unless you already know that.
No, this would be my recommendation, is you'd first want to get verification from whomever at DOL, and then we can make the system work whichever way. Because I can see it, just what you're saying, you know, somebody needs the work boots and pants to go to work. So we put those services in, but then they don't show up for work. And then you've got the supportive services is your only service. That's the reason why how current logic doesn't allow you to have a supportive service unless you do have a traditional service. So I think that would be a question for higher than me, I know that, is can a supportive service be provided prior to any other disaster recovery service?
Yes, I can ask that question, and hopefully the system is built that way to support.
Well, we can build it whichever way you want.
Okay.
But right now, it can't work. For traditional supportive services, how IWDS works,
Right.
You cannot put a supportive service in unless there's a service that's going to support that supportive service, meaning if there's no other service in IWDS, it's not going to allow a supportive service to go in. But if you put a service of case management
Right.
and you record that Jim needed boots to show up for work, then you have a service that supports that supportive service. And I know I'm kind of almost a tongue twister, but there always has to be a traditional service to support that supportive service. So it's a really good question. That, and Dina's probably, if it's Dina from LWS 7, she's asking because they're making their logic and they want to make it match ours. So it's a valid question that we have to decide. So it's something that we'll get figured out, but that's something we need answers on before we build the logic in.
Okay, now I know we're out of time, but one thing I wanted to mention is that a while back, probably half an hour back, I had clicked on somebody's question where there was a document, and I clicked on that, and I knew I shouldn't have because I'd get kicked out, and I did get kicked out. So for the past half hour, I've been back in the system, but I don't have access to the old list of questions. So I'm hoping we got to everybody's questions, but you know, there might be some in that gap of about 15 minutes or so where they're not appearing. I just have the two most recent questions. So I apologize for that. But like I said, I clicked on the document and got kicked out.
And if somebody has a question, they can shoot it to me. I'll be glad to answer it. And I can, if it's relevant for everybody, not that I make relevance, but I can send it to you, and I'll include you on any response, and you can send it out also.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, any other questions, feel free to reach out to me. I am off tomorrow, Friday, but I'll be here today. And I'll be back next week also.
Thank you very much, Jim. I appreciate it. And thanks everybody for participating. And yes, do follow up with any questions that you have. Thank you.
And as mentioned, I will be sending out that larger PowerPoint to send down to your staff who's working day to day with clients. It could be helpful for them too.
Thanks. Bye.
All right, bye.